This is 10-Minute Product Management, and my name is Nilaus. Today we're going to talk about the problems of running an organization at full capacity utilization. All right, I'm sure you've heard managers or directors or stakeholders say things like, if everyone's busy, we must be productive. Or if someone is idle, then we must have spare capacity. Or basically just treating any idle capacity as the devil and something that must be rooted out as such. Well, that's what we're going to talk about this video, and talk about what happens when that's the case. So let's start with an example that I'm sure we can all relate to, called traffic. So there's a what is it called? A theory of traffic called the three-phase theory, and this goes basically like this. So you start with an empty road, zero capacity utilization, zero flow. You start adding more cars, and you get more and more flow. It's linearly the flow is linearly proportional to the number of vehicles added because they are in a state of free flow, so they just go through. This is the blue part of this graph. Now, at some point, the number of cars on the road is starting to affect each other, and this is when we get into more of a synchronized flow. It's still flowing through, but it is at this point being a bit constrained. Still very good utilization, but at some point you are starting to get into the jam situation where you simply have added too many cars, and the actual production or the actual flow of the system decreases, even though it should peak out at the maximum capacity, but it doesn't. It just simply decreases because of congestion in the system. This is not something, or this is something we can all recognize on the road, but for some reason, this doesn't translate into business. In business, there's just an assumption that if you just jam more things into a process, you will not incur any jam situation. You will just peak out at a maximum capacity. But I don't believe it. I believe this is the case for business processes as well, hence this video. Now let's look at an example that's more sort of stylized. We have resources. Resources can be production lines, it can be machines, it can be specialists, it can be departments, it can be several processes that need to run together. And if I start with a very basic example of taking these 27 identical sized blocks that can all be put into each of these processes at random order and random sequence, then it's pretty easy. You just put 9 in each, and then that's it. That's pretty damn easy. Now, this is not what the world looks like. If this is your situation, be happy about it and just fill it up to max and be done with it. Ignore the rest of this video. However, I'm making sort of a Tetris example here, where I'm just saying, well, the real situation is more complex because tasks are not as simple. They have different sizes, they have different dependencies, they can be also sort of in dependency in time, but also dependency in which resources can actually complete the task. And again, tasks can be, or resources can be people or machines. So when we have this case, you can have a good production planner, you can have a good project manager making a nice fine plan that pretty much utilizes everything pretty efficiently, and it looks something like this. Well, again, this is not reality, is it? We've seen way too many project plans or production plans look like this that are just completely crisp, and by some sheer amount of magic, it comes together exactly on the predestined go live date. However, there are some conditions here that it's not really highlighted sufficiently clear. It says that the really condition here is that the size of each of these tasks is correct. What we've estimated will also be coming out in the end, and there's no variation. So each of the yellow ones are exactly the same size. Those conditions, we know they're not true, and this is what we're going to dive into here. So let's look at estimation, because that's where you get the size from, and that's where you will also get the cause of variation. So let's look at the size part. Can we expect that the size is correct? Well, I think a lot of cases when doing production plans or project plans, there is sort of a hidden assumption that estimation is normally distributed. And what I mean by this is that it is equally likely that an estimate of, let's say, 100 hours becomes 50 hours or 150 hours. If that's the case, then I suppose you can sort of say, if you have enough estimates or big enough sample size, then it's probably going to even out and the estimates can be used. That's not actually true, by the way, because you will still have variation, and the places where you have higher, where the estimates go above, and the places where they go below, you cannot take the parts of the capacity left when they go below and just use it for where the estimates are higher. You can't do that, rarely at least. But even that assumption, even if we accept that assumption, then it's still not true, because I don't believe that estimation is normally distributed. I believe it's more along the lines of a gamma distribution. Basically, if we have an estimate of 50 hours, and then there is a likelihood that the estimate will be 100 hours. There's also a likelihood that the estimate will be 0 hours. Basically, we don't need to do it. However, there's also a likelihood that the estimate will become 150 hours, but there is no chance that an estimate will be minus 50 hours. It just doesn't really make sense. So there is a long tail towards higher estimates. And illustrating this with a really simple example, if I'm a developer and I need to estimate a task, and I'm looking at this very basic task of saying, all right, I need 2 hours of analysis, 2 hours of coding this function, 2 hours of integrating the function into the rest of the environment, and 2 hours of testing it. All right, that's 8 hours. By the time I look into it, yeah, sure, this can be easy to program, and it could be like 1 hour of programming instead of 2 hours or 3 hours of programming. But there's also the likelihood that this function I'm building is just a steaming pile of crap, and I need to rebuild the whole damn thing, and that's 5 days of additional work. It happens, right? So the likelihood of larger estimates, it's much more likely than the likelihood of smaller estimates. And that means that our conditions previously does not hold true. There'll be more variation, and there'll be more increases, and the size is not reliable. And what happens then? We're going to see some estimates being higher, some estimates being lower, but the parts that are lower than the original estimate, you can't really utilize that additional remaining capacity you have, while the parts that get larger starts really going against hard violations of resource capacity. And this is where we get into the domain of what is the organizational response to the situation, because it's going to happen. And then we get into these familiar business buzzwords of prioritization, expediting, man, I hate that word, reallocation, task switching, management focus, overtime, all those good stuff, scope creep, and it's just, this seems like business as usual. But in my view, this is something that is completely avoidable. And it is just a consequence of decisions already taken earlier on in the project. And that's why I make this video. I want to highlight it. I want to show you could have avoided this. You stepped into you created this situation, and now you're stuck doing the usual expediting and reprioritization and cutting scope because you allowed yourself to be in this situation. This is very much the essence of Brooks' law that says adding human resources to a late software project makes it later. Because as adding more resources, you are adding more combinatorics or more communication overhead. You're adding productivity overhead. There's an assumption, sort of a hidden assumption, that productivity by resource is constant. That's not the case. I don't believe it. If I'm working on an 8-hour development task, and it gets cut into, it's not going to be 2 times 4 hours. It's going to be 2 times 5 hours. If it's going to be cut in 4, it's going to be 4 times 3 hours instead of 4 times 2 hours, and so on and so forth. So cutting things up and switching tasks is going to incur some overhead, and that's something we could have foreseen. And by thinking we can make reallocations at a later stage of a project without incurring any penalty is naive and should be avoided. So what we should do instead is make sure that we do not get into this situation in the first place by communicating this risk, by making sure that we build plans with sufficient slack inside, and also make sure that we have a plan where it's clear what is the critical activities and what are the non-critical activities, so that by the time we hit this inevitable variation, a consequence of the variation, we can start taking out the stuff that is not important instead of being sort of trying to do everything. We should melt the slack into the plan, and we should at least realize that at the end of the day, when we need to do these expediting reallocation, there is an overhead. There's a communication overhead, there's a task switching overhead, and by realizing this, we will automatically minimize the impact, because we will be aware that, all right, he's working on this task. It is better for him to finish the task instead of switching a task over to something else, because at the end of the day, and I ask, what have you been doing? I said, I've been restarting the same 3 tasks over and over because a new manager came and said, this is the most important. All right, so that's a day well spent, right? Instead of just finishing one, getting the other managers out of the way. Doesn't matter which one it is, but preferably the one already being worked on. So that's really the essence of this talk, is that when operating at full capacity, you're going to run into problems because of variation, because of unknown factors during estimation, and the contingency is going to lead to more problems because of task switching and because of communication overhead. And that's it. So avoid it. And as always on the second episode, right? I have a reading recommendation that I find is illustrating this and is quite good. This is a novel about IT and DevOps. It's fictional, but it really highlights some of the some good situations around the topics, and I'm talking here about having some key resources and some processes that are fully utilized, and all the stupid things that happen when you get into an escalation and expediting mentality. So this one is available on audiobook. If you are following this link, you can get a 1 month free trial when you sign up for a subscription. So that's just an offer. Generally speaking, all of the content I have here is available on my Confluence page. You can also follow me on YouTube, of course. So subscribe on YouTube. I would really appreciate if you could like this video, if you like it, of course, and also share it to whoever you might think could find this interesting. Maybe your manager at work would find this interesting, if you dare. And also join on Discord, where you can see you can speak to like-minded people. And of course, if you want to support me or the channel in general, there is a link to Patreon, and I'd really appreciate that as well. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you'll be checking back another time. Bye.